There are crises that erupt with noise and spectacle, and then there are those that unfold in a silence so precise, so carefully arranged, that by the time anyone realizes what is happening, the damage has already begun to take root. What happened to Deacon did not begin as a dramatic collapse or a visible act of violence. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with small changes that could have been dismissed as fatigue, stress, or the natural wear of a life lived too intensely. And that was precisely why it worked. Because the most dangerous manipulations are rarely obvious at the start. They are subtle, gradual, and designed to blend seamlessly into the fabric of normal life until they can no longer be separated from it. Deacon himself did not immediately recognize that something was wrong. The first symptoms came in fragments, a brief moment of dizziness, a flicker of disorientation that passed quickly enough to be ignored. He told himself it was nothing, that he had simply pushed himself too hard, that rest would restore whatever imbalance had briefly surfaced. But the episodes did not stop. They returned, each one slightly more intense than the last, each one leaving behind a residue of unease that he could not fully explain. It was not just physical discomfort. It was a distortion, a subtle shift in perception that made the world around him feel less stable, less reliable. By the time others began to notice, the pattern had already taken hold. Conversations with Deacon became inconsistent, his focus drifting in ways that did not align with his usual sharpness. There were moments where his thoughts seemed to fragment, where he struggled to hold onto a single idea long enough to express it clearly. And beneath it all, there was something else, something harder to define, a sense that his behavior was not just altered, but influenced, as though something external had begun to interfere with the clarity he once took for granted. Sheila, watching this unfold, did not react with panic or urgency. Her response was measured, controlled, and disturbingly composed. Where others expressed concern, she expressed certainty. Where confusion arose, she provided explanations that seemed plausible enough to be accepted, at least initially. She positioned herself not as a bystander, but as someone intimately aware of what Deacon was experiencing, someone capable of interpreting his symptoms in ways that others could not. It was a role she stepped into with unsettling ease, as though she had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. At the same time, the narrative she began to construct did not emerge all at once. It was introduced gradually, through suggestion rather than accusation, through carefully placed comments that directed attention without overtly forcing it. She spoke of medications, of interactions that could produce unexpected effects, of the delicate balance required when managing health conditions that were not always fully understood. And within that framework, she introduced Taylor, not as an obvious suspect, but as a variable, a presence whose involvement could not be entirely dismissed. Taylor, unaware of the extent of what was being set in motion, continued her routine with the confidence of someone who understood her role clearly. She had been helping Deacon, providing supplements and monitoring his well-being with the quiet diligence that defined her approach as both a doctor and a person. Her actions were consistent, her intentions transparent, her methods grounded in knowledge and care. And that was precisely what made her vulnerable. Because in a situation where trust was expected, where her involvement was seen as beneficial, the possibility that she could be implicated did not immediately register as a threat. The shift came when Deacon's condition escalated beyond what could be explained by minor imbalances. The hallucinations began subtly, fleeting distortions that he struggled to articulate. But as they intensified, they became impossible to ignore. He began to question what was real, his confidence in his own perception eroding with each episode. The world around him no longer felt stable, and the fear that accompanied that realization was immediate and overwhelming. It was no longer a matter of discomfort. It was a loss of control. When the situation reached the point where medical intervention was unavoidable, the dynamics changed rapidly. Tests were ordered, evaluations conducted, and the search for a cause began in earnest. It was within this process that Sheila's groundwork began to take effect. The focus on medication, on potential interactions, on the possibility of something being introduced into Deacon's system without his awareness, gained traction. And as that focus narrowed, the presence of Taylor within that context became increasingly difficult to separate. The discovery of the altered supplements did not come as a dramatic revelation. It emerged through careful analysis, through the kind of detailed examination that reveals inconsistencies only to those who know what to look for. The substances found within them did not match what had been prescribed or intended. Instead, they contained compounds capable of inducing the very symptoms Deacon had been experiencing, compounds that could distort perception, disrupt cognition, and create a state of vulnerability that left him unable to trust his own mind. For those observing from the outside, the conclusion seemed to present itself with alarming clarity. Taylor had access. Taylor had knowledge. Taylor had provided the supplements. The alignment of these factors created a narrative that was difficult to immediately refute. And as that narrative began to circulate, both within official channels and through less controlled means, it took on a life of its own. Taylor's realization that she was being framed did not arrive with panic. It arrived with precision, with a clarity that cut through the confusion and pointed directly to the underlying truth. She understood immediately that this was not a misunderstanding, not a misinterpretation of evidence. It was a deliberate construction, a manipulation designed to place her in a position where defending herself would require more than simply stating the truth. It would require proof, and not just any proof, but proof that could dismantle a narrative that had already begun to solidify. The pressure mounted quickly. As the investigation intensified, so did the scrutiny. Questions became more pointed, assumptions more direct. The trust she had built over years of practice did not disappear, but it was no longer enough to shield her from doubt. And beyond the formal investigation, there was another force at work, one that operated without restraint or accountability. The media, fed by carefully placed information, began to shape public perception in ways that amplified suspicion and reduced complexity to something far more damaging. Sheila's influence in this aspect of the situation was subtle but undeniable. She did not present herself as the source of the information. She allowed it to circulate, to be picked up and repeated by those eager for a story that combined personal history, professional authority, and the possibility of betrayal. The suggestion that Taylor might have acted out of jealousy, that her connection to Deacon's past could have influenced her actions, provided a narrative that was both sensational and easy to accept. And in a world where perception often moves faster than truth, that narrative gained traction with alarming speed. For Taylor, the race against time became both professional and personal. Deacon's condition was deteriorating, his ability to recover dependent on identifying and counteracting the substance affecting him. At the same time, her own position was becoming increasingly precarious, her credibility under attack, her every action scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. She could not afford to focus on one without addressing the other. Saving Deacon and clearing her name were no longer separate objectives. They were intertwined, each dependent on the success of the other. She approached the problem with the discipline that had defined her career. Emotion, though present, could not be allowed to interfere with analysis. She reviewed the evidence, not as someone defending herself, but as a doctor seeking the truth. The compounds found in the supplements were not random. They had been selected with intention, chosen for their ability to produce specific effects while remaining difficult to detect without targeted analysis. This was not an accident. It was a design. Tracing the design required more than standard procedure. It required insight into the kind of thinking that would create such a situation, the kind of precision that suggested not just knowledge, but experience. And as Taylor followed that line of reasoning, the possibilities narrowed, not because there were many potential suspects, but because there was one whose pattern of behavior aligned too closely with what she was uncovering to be ignored. The realization did not bring relief. It brought urgency, because identifying Sheila as the architect of the situation was only the first step. Proving it in a way that could withstand scrutiny, that could dismantle the narrative she had constructed, required evidence that was both concrete and irrefutable. And time was not on her side. Deacon's condition was worsening, the effects of the substance compounding in ways that made recovery increasingly difficult without intervention. As she worked to develop a countermeasure to identify a way to neutralize the effects of the drug, the pressure intensified. Every delay, every moment without progress, increased the risk not just to Deacon, but to her own ability to defend herself. The media continued to amplify the narrative against her, each report adding another layer of distortion that made the truth harder to reach. And yet, within that chaos, there was a clarity that sustained her. She knew what she was capable of. She knew the difference between what she had done and what she was being accused of. And she understood that the only way to restore that truth was not through argument, but through action, through results that could not be denied. The final stages of her effort were defined by a focus so intense that everything else fell away. The antidote, once identified, required precise application, careful monitoring, and a level of confidence that allowed no room for doubt. It was not just a medical intervention. It was a statement, a demonstration that the narrative being constructed against her could not withstand the reality of what she was able to achieve. As Deacon began to respond, as the clarity in his mind slowly returned, the balance began to shift. The evidence that had once pointed toward Taylor now revealed inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. The narrative that had been so carefully constructed began to unravel, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable presence of truth. Sheila, faced with this shift, did not immediately collapse under the weight of exposure. Her response, as always, was calculated, an attempt to adapt, to redirect, to maintain control in a situation that was slipping beyond her grasp. But the precision that had once worked in her favor now worked against her. The very details she had relied on to frame Taylor became the points through which her own involvement could be traced. In the end, the situation did not resolve cleanly. The damage had been done, the trust that had been shaken not easily restored. But within that complexity, there was a resolution of a different kind, one that did not erase what had happened, but redefined it. Taylor's name, though tested, stood on the strength of what she had proven, not just about the situation, but about herself. And Deacon, emerging from the fog that had been imposed upon him, was left to confront a reality that was as unsettling as it was clear. The danger he had faced had not come from where it appeared to originate. It had been constructed, orchestrated, and sustained by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate perception, how to turn trust into vulnerability. What remained, after everything had been revealed, was not just the aftermath of a crisis, but the lingering awareness of how easily truth can be distorted when placed in the wrong hands. And in that awareness, there was a quiet, persistent question, one that could not be easily answered. Not whether something like this could happen again, but how to recognize it before it reached the point where recognition alone was no longer enough. The arrest did not come at a moment of chaos or heightened confrontation. It came with a quiet, devastating finality that made it all the more unreal. Taylor had just begun to believe she was regaining control of the narrative, that the evidence she had painstakingly gathered, the progress she had made in stabilizing Deacon, and the cracks she had exposed in the fabricated story surrounding her would be enough to shift the tide. But reality, shaped by timing and perception rather than truth alone, moved faster than her ability to correct it. By the time the authorities stepped forward, armed with warrants and a carefully constructed case, the story had already solidified in ways that made resistance feel almost symbolic. She did not resist. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part of it. There was no dramatic denial, no desperate attempt to escape the moment. Instead, there was a stillness, a composed acceptance that masked the storm building beneath the surface. Taylor understood exactly what this meant not just in terms of legal consequence, but in terms of perception. The moment she was taken into custody, the image would spread, the narrative would be reinforced, and the complexity of what had actually happened would be reduced to something far simpler, far more damaging. A respected doctor accused of poisoning a man she had been treating, possibly driven by jealousy, possibly hiding something darker. It was a story too compelling for the world to question. As she was led away, the weight of that realization settled into her in a way that felt heavier than the physical restraint of the situation. This was not just about proving innocence anymore. It was about reclaiming truth in a landscape where truth had already been reshaped. And for the first time since she had recognized Sheila's manipulation, there was a moment where doubt tried to surface, not doubt in her innocence, but doubt in her ability to overcome a system that had already begun to align against her. Behind the scenes, Sheila observed the development with a calm that bordered on satisfaction. She had anticipated resistance, had expected Taylor to fight, to push back with logic and evidence. What she had not fully accounted for was how quickly the narrative would take hold once it was reinforced by official action. The arrest was not just a legal move. It was validation, a confirmation in the eyes of the public that the suspicion surrounding Taylor had merit. And that validation was more powerful than any argument Sheila could have made herself. But even within that calculated success, there was a subtle shift. Sheila understood better than anyone that control in situations like this was never absolute. The more complex the scheme, the more variables it introduced, the more opportunities there were for something unexpected to emerge. And Taylor, despite being placed in a position of vulnerability, was not someone easily dismantled. Her strength did not come from outward resistance, but from a deeper, more methodical resilience that Sheila had not fully eliminated. In custody, Taylor's world narrowed, not physically, but psychologically. The noise of the outside world, the speculation, the judgment, the shifting alliances, all faded into something distant, replaced by a focused clarity that began to reassert itself. Stripped of the immediate pressure to respond to every accusation, every development, she found herself returning to the core of what mattered. The facts, the sequence of events, the evidence that existed not in interpretation, but in reality. She began to reconstruct everything, not as a defense, but as a diagnosis. Where had the manipulation begun? How had the substitution been executed without detection? What patterns in Deacon's symptoms could be traced back to specific compounds, specific timings, specific interactions? These are not just questions of innocence. They were questions of understanding, and in that understanding lay the key to dismantling everything that had been built against her. Meanwhile, Deacon's condition continued to evolve. The intervention Taylor had initiated before her arrest had begun to take effect, slowly stabilizing him, clearing the fog that had clouded his perception. As his awareness returned, so too did fragments of memory, small details that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried a different weight. The way Sheila had been present at specific moments, the subtle inconsistencies in what he had consumed, the timing of his symptoms in relation to those interactions. None of it was conclusive on its own, but together it began to form a pattern. For those close to him, the shift was noticeable. Deacon was not just recovering physically. He was beginning to question, to revisit what had happened with a clarity that had been impossible before. And with that clarity came a growing unease, a realization that the story he had been told, the explanation that had seemed plausible in his compromised state, did not fully align with what he was now able to recall. Outside, the pressure on the investigation intensified. What had once seemed like a straightforward case began to show signs of complexity that could not be easily ignored. The evidence against Taylor, while compelling on the surface, contained inconsistencies that required explanation. The compounds found, the method of delivery, the timing of the symptoms, all pointed toward a level of sophistication that did not align with the narrative of a spontaneous act driven by emotion. And within that shifting landscape, the first cracks in Sheila's carefully constructed reality began to appear. They were not dramatic. They did not immediately expose her, but they introduced doubt, the kind that does not disappear once it has taken hold. Investigators began to look beyond the obvious, to consider alternatives that had previously been dismissed. And as they did, the scope of the situation expanded, revealing layers that had not been fully examined. For Taylor, the knowledge that this process was unfolding reached her not through direct confirmation, but through subtle changes in the way she was treated, the questions that were asked, the tone that shifted from certainty to cautious reconsideration. It was not enough to restore her freedom, not yet, but it was enough to reinforce what she had always known, that the truth, no matter how obscured, had a way of resurfacing when pursued with enough persistence. The race against time did not end with her arrest. It intensified, because now the stakes were not just about clearing her name or saving Deacon. They were about exposing a manipulation that had extended beyond a single act, beyond a single victim, into a pattern that, if left unchallenged, would continue to unfold in ways no one could fully predict. And at the center of it all remained Sheila, still moving carefully, still adapting, still maintaining the illusion of control. But the balance had shifted, however slightly. The certainty she had relied on was no longer absolute. The narrative she had constructed was no longer unchallenged. And for the first time since she had set this plan into motion, there was a possibility, however distant, that the truth she had buried might find its way back to the surface. What would happen when it did was no longer a question of if, but when. And when that moment arrived, it would not just determine the fate of Taylor or Deacon. It would redefine everything that had been built on deception, forcing each of them to confront not just what had been done, but what it revealed about the limits of control, the fragility of trust, and the consequences of believing